Well, good afternoon. Hello, Todd. Good to see you again. Having said that, I need to point out this talk has been pre-recorded at the recommendation of the organizers. I'm in a remote area with an unstable or unreliable connection. So this is recorded a day before the conference began. Um, The focus of the talk is, well, first let me also say that I'm going to be moving very fast. The ground we got to cover is a lot, so the slides may go by quickly. Um, Consider the fact that this is being memorialized in some way so that for those interested, you will be able to go back, play it more slowly, and look at the slides more carefully. And for those wanting to unpack this further, because this will still be a sketch, there are a full list of references at the end where you can go and unpack everything that's talked about in here in a lot more detail. So the focus of this talk is really about the trying to meet the objective, or I believe meeting the objective of the conference organizers. That is bridging the gap between the natural and the social sciences, although I think that these terms alone show that we have bought into obviously an artificial gap, an incommensurability that I want to show has been built into the foundations of modern science from the beginning. And I think that when we talk about building a bridge or say yoking things together, we're already accepting what is should be unacceptable. We need to go back to the foundation and dissolve these postulates of incommensurability. So background and introduction, a little review. The foundations of modern science following Bacon were built essentially, although on Newtonian physics, they were built on Cartesian metaphysics. And so physics and psychology, that is really what was then taken to be the dead, mechanical, reversible view of the world, was separated at its origins by Descartes. And it's ramifications of this that have tributaries that have flown out ever since and brought us to this present place, this gap that we're concerned about. So in this case, mind, that is all the active, striving, creative part of the world, was taken out of the physical world. The physical world was seen to be a passive, inert, reversible, and deterministic, qualityless mechanical system defined by extension in space and time, whereas the mind was considered unbounded in space and time. So the immediate implicates of this were essentially that one, as I've said, all the active and directive and creative behavior, the kind of things we're concerned about, obviously, in human social systems, is removed from, and biological systems, I will say as well, is removed from the physical world, as Bacon had said it should be. From the beginning, this had to do with a deal made effectively, metaphorically, between the Pope and Galileo. Because these giant reversible machines, these clockwork machines that the world was supposed to be a model of the world, needed extra physical ordering from the outside to give it shape and make it work, with God as the universal watchmaker. Later, this became mind, and later other magic makers, such as selfish genes, that were supposedly thought to claim to bring this active dimension somehow miraculously into biology from a dead world of physics. Striving algorithms given an active property, which we'll show later, of course, is absolutely an inaccurate characterization. Now, by definition, mind defined this way as not locatable in space and time and so on, and other reasons that I've given there by the definition, is actually logically forbidden from interacting with the physical world. So eventually, the physical world ontology and the history of philosophy and so on going through modern science, actually ontology ends up being abandoned. And eventually epistemology simply becomes the creation of human minds or individual minds. Group solipsism and all these kind of issues are kind of hand waved over. But mind ends up, in other words, perceiving itself. This is the Cartesian circle, and perception becomes an act of the construction or the imagination. So perception, that is what we view of reality, is taken to be an act of the imagination. You can see this coming from Hume and all the way down, leading to later forms of the most probably prevalent, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes unrecognized, sometimes assumed without people knowing it, of constructivism that dominates the social sciences today, and also the bringing forth epistemologies, for example, that later on became kind of enactivism and the autopoietic theory of life, and activism, which you see in the 4E theories of cognition, and so on. This is all very much living today, and it's living amongst us. In fact, it's dominating pretty much certainly the social science discourse. So in the case of social science, then the Cartesian circle is transposed to the human social level. And we see talks of human social systems as essentially closed circles. You can trace this down from Wittgenstein, language games, and so on. Truth is established, reality is essentially created within these circles and incommensurable between any of them, in fact. You need to see references if you want to see that developed more clearly or fully. So then comes along Kant, and he introduces a second postulate of incommensurability. He kind of ramps this up a little bit, noting that the active and directed striving of living things, so this would go from, basically living things, ordinary biologically construed to human social systems, cannot be accounted for by the dead reversible mechanical world of physics, and so talked about a kind of a teleology that was inherent to biological systems, and promoted a second incommensurability, that between living systems and physics, or living systems and their environment, human systems and their environment, and so on. We see this coming into evolutionary theory with what was taken to be kind of taken for granted, the quote, autonomy of biology claim of leading neo-Darwinian theorists, and brought that into biology. So there's where we begin, and until we come to now the middle of the 19th century, and all of a sudden come the laws of thermodynamics, which is a threat to the mechanical worldview. So Parmenides, and here going way back to the pre-Socratics, the debate and the argument and the two different schools, the Parmenidean school and the Heraclitean school, the Eleatics, the Parmenideans, changes in illusion, Parmenides, and all is flux or flow, Heraclites. We can see these in a way as talking about persistence and change, and anticipating in a way the laws of thermodynamics. So comes along now Davies and others, Mayer, who shook water in a glass jar and showed you could elevate the temperature of it by shaking it in a jar. Tried to claim the first law and write a paper and get it published. The paper was rejected, by the way. Anyway, that's a tangent. And later Joule with the experiment you're seeing here, basically leading to the understanding that the heat and mechanical energy were the same. And this was basically led to the formation of the understanding of the first law, which is the conservation of energy. That's in very simple terms, but in deeper terms, it's a symmetry principle, and it refers to the remarkable time translation symmetry. So think about it. It means in any direction you go, forward and back, up or down, something always remains the same. It's a deep, deep, remarkable thing. Tells us about the unity of all things. Immediately now we're starting to bridge, if you will, I won't say bridge this gap, to dissolve these postulates of incommensurability. But earlier Carnot had showed, of course, that with the fall of, that looking for the motive force that drove a steam engine, he understood and analogized this to how the drop of water from a higher to a lower place, moves a mill wheel, and saw the motive force arose from the loss of availability, that is the availability for producing this change. And so it was the availability, or in a way, the use of the availability, that drove the mill wheel, and essentially with the heat flow drove the steam engine. But this created a problem at that time, because if energy is conserved, there had to be a second quantity that was lost. Comes to the second law of thermodynamics, which physicalized change, and where end-directedness, Francis Bacon, now comes into the world nomologically. It's a big deal. And so Clausius and Thomson, explicitly, they recognized this problem between Carnot and Jules, Davies, and Mayer. And Clausius coined the term entropy to sound like energy, to refer to what was effectively the inverse of Carnot's availability or potential. And the second law, in the most general form, says that all natural processes proceed towards to maximize the entropy, or equivalently minimize the potential availability, or equivalently all natural processes, in all natural processes, the entropy always increases. That gives us the balance equation of the second law. In all natural processes, the entropy always increases, except at equilibrium, where the change in entropy is zero. This gave scientific meaning to final cause, bringing end-directedness nomologically into the world as a universal entailment from first principles. Sorry, Sir Francis Bacon. Here's some examples. Boltzmann comes along then and attempts to save the mechanical worldview by reducing the second law to a stochastic collision function, modeling gas molecules as billiard balls in a box. He showed that with each collision, coherent ordered distributions will become more disordered, and argued that because disordered configurations are far more probable than ordered ones, a system will always be in a state either of maximum disorder or heading towards it. He wrote, molecules moving at the same speed and in the same direction is the most improbable case conceivable and infinitely improbable configuration of energy. Now with this, the second law became known as a law of disorder. And evolutionary theory then took the view that the evolution of life from the simplest living thing on through the rise of humankind, human social system, were working against the second law, against the laws of physics. Here's some examples, some quotes from neo-Darwinian theorists. You can read them later if you'd like. But then came along Schrödinger and Bertalanffy and mitigated this to some extent, pointing out that such systems, living systems, would not violate the classical version of the second law as long as such systems produced enough entropy to compensate for their own internal entropy reduction. There's an error in the slide here. It should say entropy reduction, not production. So as long as they paid their entropy debt, as it was put sometimes, they were permitted to exist. The balance equation of the second law could then be written in two parts, external and internal. Now, this made such systems permitted to exist, but still did not solve the problem that, according to Boltzmann and the received view, they were infinitely improbable. And what you see in evolutionary in the history of the Earth is the rise of increasingly more ordered states, and also that they arise opportunistically as soon as they get the chance. The fecundity principle, the sine qua non of Darwinian theory, that nature strives to fill out the economy of nature, also which natural selection depends on but doesn't explain, was also sitting in contradiction or in defiance of this physical law. But simple physical experiments repeatedly falsify Boltzmann's hypothesis. Here's some of the well-known classical Baynard experiments and pictures from our lab from many decades ago. And what happens here is that every time minimal conditions are met, when the gradient is above a certain steepness. Spontaneous order, ACK systems arise not infinitely improbably, as Michael Turvey and I pointed out in our 1991 paper, but with a probability of 1. That is, opportunistically every single time and as soon as they get the chance. So this suggested the need for a physical selection principle. This is outside biology, but biology arises from it. And that would account for the spontaneous ordering from macro to micro. We go back to the Bertalanffy-Schrödinger observation, but look at it in a different way. And the takeaway from this is that every single time we have this kind of order arising, the rate of entropy production goes dramatically up. This takes us to the place of understanding that the selection principle about path selection is based on rates and leads us to ask the question that Schrödinger, Bertalanffy, or later Prigogine never asked, namely, which path out of available paths will a system take to minimize the potential or maximize the entropy? The second law says nothing about rates or paths. It only says entropy increases. But if we look at the universality in all of these path selection processes, it is just that the rate of entropy production goes up, is increased. So the answer to the question, which paths out of available paths, is just what we chose to call the law of maximum entropy production, LMEP, or the fourth law, which is given as follows. The world, a system, will select the path or assembly of paths out of available paths that minimizes the potential or maximizes the entropy at the fastest rate given the constraints. Now, of course, LMEP says nothing about ordering per se, but the ordering principle is easy to derive at this place. So if LMEP, the world selects paths, and if ordered flow produces entropy at a faster rate than disordered flow, the balance equation of the second law, then the world can be expected to select paths or produce entropy, produce order from disorder whenever and as soon as it gets the chance. And of course, this is just what happens opportunistically and ubiquitously around us and in the evolutionary record, and can be demonstrated in simple, reproducible physical experiments as often as we like. An intuitive understanding of this also Michael Turvey and I gave in that same paper, The Cabin in the Woods, and you have a fire, a cold woods, and you have a fire in the fireplace, and so there's a steep gradient, and the heat, the system is looking to a way to reduce that gradient, so heat is flowing out through the walls or maybe cracks and so forth around the windows. But if you open a window or open a door, then the heat will move out through that faster path, and in fact, it will choose the faster paths always to minimize that potential, and where there are multiple paths, it'll assign the most flow to the paths with the fastest rate and distribute the other accordingly subsequently, so that the assembly of paths work to bring that gradient down at the fastest possible rates out of available paths. ACK systems, identity through flow. So we've talked about the mechanical model, machine view, static components put together by outside makers, but living systems are flow structures. They are ACK systems. They constitute their identity through flow. And so do the Baynard cells that we looked at and other physical non-living systems. So the general class of systems includes simple physical systems as well as living systems from single cells to civilization, and the planetary system as a whole, which is a single ACK system. An ACK system is defined as one that maintains itself as an entity constituted by and empirically traceable to a set of nonlinear, circularly causal relations to the dissipation or breakdown of environmental potentials, resources, in the continuous coordinated motion of its components. So here we see an ACK system in the schematic maintaining itself between a source and a sink, E1, E2, producing a flow of entropy. and through its maintaining its circular relations by using E, which is the onboard potential energy carried in its components, the feedback of internal force F to amplify the flow or maintain the flow coming in at the input. With an ACK system, the self as identity and actor or agency comes from the empirically traceable ACK closure of the circular relations constituted through the asymmetry of the source-sink flow. Selected or seeded at their origins, their birth, their edification by microscopic fluctuation, stochasticity, the selfishness of an ACK system is both manifested and located in the fact that through the circular relations that define them, they are self-amplifying sinks or deviation-amplifying systems. Their existence, selection macro from micro, is predicated on the fact that the coordinated motions of their components by which their identity is defined, with that they expand the dimensions of space-time, thereby providing universal access to otherwise inaccessible, unoccupied, dissipative sinks. And the fecundity principle on which evolutionary biology depends is recovered here from first principles. I'm running out of time. The only way I'm going to keep this roughly within the 30 minutes is to pretty much flip through these slides to the end. I'll bring up each slide so that if you want to, after this is memorialized and you want to go back and look at this again, you can pause them and you can read the slides, and of course also look at the references. So here the generalized selection dynamics of ACK systems, very important. They're generic, so they're level independent, and so they're relevant to social systems, human, social, and economic systems. And quickly to the questions that are being asked here, or that have been asked. What is life? Life is an ACK system with replicating components. That is a replicative system. This is not a replicating system, a replicative system. So the planet as a whole is a replicative system. Human social systems are a replicative system. They are living systems. They are not necessarily replicating systems. Second definition, what is life? This is from the way that it behaves. It's an ACK system that maintains its autocatakinetics by using information about or meaning to seek out, discover, and maintain its autocatakinetics using non-local potentials to feed on. So this is different. If I pull the source away or the gradient away from a Baynard cell, it will, or a tornado or something, it will die. It will go out of existence. If I do that with a living system, it will oftentimes become more active. It'll go out and discover new potentials, non-local potentials, using its onboard potential to skate across these local potentials to discover more sources to feed off of. So a living system, what is life? A living system from the earliest prokaryote to human socio-systems, cultural systems, is coextensive with intelligent system, cognitive system, perceiving acting system, or epistemic system. Life is an epistemic process. Why life? The epistemic process provides the world access to otherwise inaccessible dimension of dissipative space. So living systems are end-directed systems whose behavior is determined by semantic content or meaning, and we now can understand how to get to that, principally from first law symmetry. Now, rate-independent constraints, a very important primitive for intentional agents or intelligent systems, living systems, replicative systems. And examples are DNA strings, are the words that you're reading here in the slides, my language, and also algorithms. It's important to understand what these are and what they are not. human socioeconomic systems coming to the end. This is going to be very sketchy. They are deviation amplifying systems on steroids. Human language and culture, technology, all the social media, globalization has produced accelerating access to otherwise previously inaccessible dissipative dimensions. A canonical ACK system is a minimal ontology, is an economic system. It comes into being by its ability to outcompete other dissipated flows. It constitutes itself using value it creates, its onboard potential, that's E3, to reinvest in its own maintenance and growth, amplification. Its life depends upon it meeting minimal levels of productivity. While motivated by the fourth law, it must meet the balance equation of the second law. We need to incorporate autocatakinetics in economic theory, which is really sadly deficient at this point in time. From autonomous hunter-gatherer groups, populations of one, or tribes, 99% of human history, to the rise of nation states, to the explosive globalization going on today, ACK systems as components in higher ordered ACK systems have the same generic behavior at play, and it's important to understand this. I'm going to have to leave it to you to review this and study in more detail, but 2 points quickly that I want to hit on right now is that ACK systems, including human social systems, are seeded by stochasticities, fluctuations, where small changes under certain types of conditions lead to big macroscopic changes, system overturns, revolutions, and so small differences can have huge consequences when the system is at a certain place in time. Places in time. ACK systems are determined by progressive determinism. That is, that as they develop over time, they progressively freeze out, they building higher states of order, greater connectivity, they freeze out the degrees of freedom of the components and the parts. Typically, ACK systems, replicative systems, have a lifespan. What happens over time during this developmental process, this progressive determinism, as the degrees of freedom are frozen out, is that the value of the system, as the center of the system gets hollowed out, the value of the system is held by the larger leading parts. An example would be, for example, a redwood forest, where the largest part of the system, the internal system, is virtually dead, and pretty much the living part is only on a very, very small percentage of the biomass. This happens in all ACK replicative systems, and it is happening in our present sociocultural system. Things like income disparity, where value is being pushed out to a very, very small percentage of the population, therefore the system being therefore hollowed out, is symptomatic of later stages in ACK systems development, and at times when they are very, very susceptible to collapse or small changes. The recent current COVID crisis, where something so small comes up so fast and pretty much radically changes the behavior of people in the world, and it's not done yet, is an example of how a small change in a system that is not stable at this point. There's other things going on now too. It's important for us to understand this if we're going to study socioeconomic systems, understand where we are, where we might be, and how a system needs to be situated to maintain its stability. So I'm going to close and end there. I'll flip over to the references, and I'll leave them up for a couple of minutes. And I don't think I've gone much over. And great idea for this conference, and I hope that the outcome is very productive. New theory built on deep principle is very, very important to the social sciences. In fact, it it's easy to see why it may be actually crucial at this time. This is not simply an academic pursuit, but it is a question of what's going to happen to the world, to human civilization, and so on in the next few years, the next decade after that. So with that, I'll say thank you, goodbye, and happy trails and blue skies. Good luck.
All right, so I believe we have until, well, I think we have roughly 10 minutes for questions and discussion. Is that correct, Christine? Or
yes.
Rod? Is that
yes.
correct? Okay.
Yeah, that's right, Todd.
And also Rod is not on the call, so we can't ask him questions directly, but I guess we could discuss some of his ideas. But I'll open it to the floor now for questions for any of the speakers. Catalin, Wasim, and of course Rod's not on board, but we can discuss some of his ideas, of course. So who would like to start? And just chime in.
If you don't mind, I can start.
No? Please do.
Yeah, I sent this question by chat. So this is actually about rods, the just talk, the last talk. And basically there's some thoughts, came to me that, I mean, this fourth law of the proposed fourth law, which, system produce maximal rate of entropy production. But basically I want to connect it with climate change, because what we, humans as a whole, what we are doing, we're by burning fossil fuels, right? We achieved unprecedented rate of entropy production, right? And according to this fourth law, it's a very logical point, like as it was explained, one way or another, sooner or later, this system, life on Earth, will get to this point of finding way of opportunistically to burn these fossil fuels as much as possible, because that's what is a fourth law. Okay, and by the way, science, thermodynamics and science of thermodynamics specifically helped with that, because without, it basically enabled engineers to burn fuels at a maximal rate. Without that scientific advancement, it was not as much. So it's partially science to blame as well, symbols and culture, etc. So anyway, my point is, right now we achieved the stage of unprecedented entropy production by growing fossil fuels. And I don't see, it's very pessimistic, because according to this fourth law, there is no way out of it. Because, for example, renewable energy cannot possibly compete with it. The entropy production in renewable energy would be necessarily much smaller than fossil fuels, because renewable energy, you take energy in real time, solar or wind, and you dissipate it. But that rate is nothing compared to burning what accumulated in the earth for millions of years. There's no way to compete. And so I would say, if I follow logically fourth law, unfortunately, I come to very pessimistic conclusion. There is absolutely no way to stop this climate change, because it's opportunistic, it's distributed. No matter what we, educated people can talk about it, or policies, or politicians, or whatever, some people somewhere will find ways around it and will keep burning it, because that's where fourth law is supposed to be, and we are there. So that's very pessimistic. Yeah. Anyway, so if anybody, I mean, if there is any hope, my question is,
right, well, let's give others a chance to comment.
Just quickly, regarding the comments and discussion I'll offer here, Todd was certainly correct when he said that I was not able to join the discussion online as it happened due to technical reasons and being in a remote area. So my answer, so I was given the questions, the discussion, so that I could answer offline, and that's what I'm doing. And so I'll offer a few thoughts on the discussion questions that have been raised. With respect to Victor's interesting thoughts and I think reasonable concern, let me just say that so I appreciate the thought, and I share it. We live in a completely solar home, by the way, full disclosure. More than 15 years, and we produce more power than we use. We feed back into the grid, actually, so we are a power plant in a way for the rest of our town and county and state, and it's all solar, all clean energy. But the notion that we will burn fossil fuels because they produce entropy faster, and therefore renewables can't compete is not a worry. There are worries, but that is not one. We got to the use of fossil fuels because we're talking LMEP, the fourth law, as Victor pointed out, is an opportunistic principle. So selection from micro to macro and between ACK systems is opportunistic. The systems are selected that can build structure, reduce potentials faster than other pathways to doing so. So the human culture, our addiction, if you will, to fossil fuels, did not happen because during or prior to the Industrial Revolution, a group of people got together and said, well, let's start the Industrial Revolution and we'll use fossil fuels, not solar, because it produces entropy faster. So fossil fuels were used because that's what was the potential, the gradient that was available there and then opportunistically at the time. And with the discovery that you could convert, that heat was convertible to mechanical energy, so which led us into the laws of thermodynamics, it was a huge breakthrough. But started because solar in that sense was not available. So the discovery of linking coal and wood burning furnaces and so forth to producing machines, steam engines and so on, that's how it started. It was convenient, and it's generally been more convenient since. We are in fact moving more to renewables, and so the point being is that intentional systems, that is systems, all living systems, human cultural systems, whose end-directed behavior, their autocatakinesis, is determined by aboutness, by meaning, by information in the law-based sense. And read some of our further references for the discussion of this, not to be confused with any of this Shannon entropy or information. We're talking about meaning, end-directed behavior determined by meaning. Their business is to seek, discover, and locate potentials by which they can build their own structure. They are deviation autocatakinetic systems, are deviation amplifying systems, and they feed back through their circularity into putting the potentials they burn into the amplifying, the building of their own structure and the expansion of their own structure. Those that do it at the fastest rate are the ones that arise and the ones that remain. So fossil fuels are, in fact, a non-renewable resource. And if there's enough time, and it's not clear that there will be for sure, because there are all kinds of other variables that are worth being concerned about. As far as ACOMAP goes, that is the fourth law, autocatakinesis of human systems, human sociocultural systems, following from the fourth law. And we are as I tried to point to in my talk, we are clearly in instability right now. Environmental pollution is one of the indicators. But if there were to be enough time, renewables will replace, that is solar, for example, will replace fossil fuels, because fossil fuels will run out. And by the way, the autocatakinesis of Earth, the evolution of what we see of life, and from the simplest prokaryote on through human civilizations and the globalization going on today, is powered by the solar gradient, the difference between the solar source and the deep heat sink of space. And so, but along the way, for example, prokaryotes, autotrophs, that learn to capture the solar gradient and convert it into themselves and their kind. As Michael Turby and I pointed out in our paper, Thermodynamic Reasons, where we discuss the origin of vision, those things became food for heterotrophs who were not able to feed on the solar gradient itself. So using something which is essentially stored gradient or potential, which fossil fuels are, is something that is part of the way living systems have always operated. So I think I'll just leave that there. And I think it was really a good thought. I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about the way that ACOMAP works with respect to amplifying human social systems, which certainly by all indicators look like they are pulling the rug out from under themselves. Okay, thanks.
Can I say? Oh, sorry.
Please do. Go ahead.
Okay.
Amos.
First of all, unfortunately, to some degree, I believe if he's not right, he's uncomfortably close to right. I'm disturbed by the statement that there is a race for maximum production of entropy. I don't think it works that way, and Howard Odom's concept of maximum power is not about a maximum, but an optimum rate of use of all kinds of things. And his paper in 1955, which there should be some way we can give an email to everybody, but his paper in 1955, which I'm happy to send out to everybody, you need to think about that very carefully, because you can't, there's too much imposition that somehow the dynamics of physics is going to determine what goes on, where the dynamics of life are not, they must work within the constraints of physics, but they have their own opportunities, their own ends, so to speak, derived through natural selection, which I do not believe is maximum production of entropy, but optimal rate of production of entropy towards their own ends, which isn't production of energy, but is production of transmissible biological structures, which is a very different conception than maximum production of entropy. I'll stop there, but if anybody wants to email me, I can explain it more carefully.
So thank you for these thoughts and discussion. So when you are saying that biological systems have their own opportunities and their own ends derived through natural selection as separate from what you're calling the constraints of physics, this pretty much echoes the old autonomy of biology doctrine that really inhibited biological evolutionary theory for the better part of the last century, maybe still does so to some extent, and follows from this, this discussion that I tried to introduce, although admittedly everything was very quick in my talk, following from Cartesian metaphysics, and then the second postulate of incommensurability, that is introduced by Kant, this autonomy of biology, that the teleology or end-directedness of living things is separate from the physical world. This is early on, this is of course a form of vitalism, and then it became manifested in various forms as time went on, somewhat more sophisticated forms. But the notion that the end-directedness of living things is accounted for by natural selection is really what, to most of us, really could be construed as probably the biggest problem with evolutionary theory of the previous, the end of the previous last century, and so on. And it as follows. So Natural select. The problem with it is as follows: natural selection is entailed, as Popper, pointed out, by a situational logic. I think we can all agree on these general things. I think you'll agree too. Namely, if certain conditions hold, then natural selection will follow. And these conditions, though, are one, heritable variation. That's what you've talked about, transmissible structure, and so on. Are heritable variation, finite resources, that's Malthusian constraints, and three, the fecundity principle, namely the general biological or Darwinian principle, the active striving of living things to, in Darwin's terms, quote, fill out the economy of nature, striving to seize on every unoccupied or less occupied space in the economy of nature. But notice that this makes natural selection completely dependent on this opportunistic and directed behavior of life in order to work. So natural selection then does not explain this behavior. It is, in fact, the consequence of it. And this puts the opportunistic and directed behavior of life, of living things, outside the explanatory framework of natural selection. That's the problem. Now, ACLMAP, that is ACKLMEP, ACLMAP, autocatakinetics, following from the fourth law, explains it. Life, and it is a manifestation of the fourth law. Selection is entailed by autocatakinesis, self-organization, appropriately defined. And natural selection is a special case where the components are replicating. So natural selection is a consequence of the fourth law, and the fecundity principle is explained by the fourth law. That's the work it does. So this is not to say anything about natural selection being wrong. It's just that as an explanatory principle, it falls far short of doing the job that the kind of claim that you're making would want it to do, need it to do. And ACLMAP does that. So the epistemic nature of this process too, that of the evolution of life, the origin of life, of cognitive systems, is coextensive, importantly, with the origin and evolution of life, and human socio-cultural systems follow from the same principle. But by the way, natural selection, of course, doesn't help us with cultural evolution because it's defined by selection on changing gene frequencies and so on. So, but ACLMAP does. It provides the foundation for a general theory of evolution which incorporates and explains natural selection, but takes it from its origins and takes it through human sociocultural systems. But I need to give you some references because I can't really do justice to it here. And the first one is a place where, I don't know, many decades ago, 3 decades ago at least, was a very active discussion on the relationship between autocatakinesis, that is self-organization, and natural selection. This was a time when the idea of self-organizing systems was getting legs. And so the first reference includes a review of that and discussion about it. And then the other ones are also well worth reading in terms of the general nature of this kind of LMAP, ACLMAP, and natural selection, evolution, and so on. Just quickly, I didn't mention Howard Odum at the beginning. Howard Odum was really a great, innovative thinker, and you referred to his maximum power principle. I have a lot of stories about Howard Odum. He used some of the pictures of our Baynard experiments, which I showed in my talk, in a couple of his books. And so I have really only great things to say about him, except that the maximum power principle has a number of flaws. I obviously don't have the space to go into it here. One of them is, though, of course, that it's derived, it follows from Lotka's ideas. Both of these people were great in the sense that they put ecology, evolution, and so on in energetic terms, which is a big, big deal. So they both deserve huge credit for that. But it follows also from natural selection. So it's not a universal principle. Again, it's about the consequence of natural selection. And so therefore it fails on that one reason for the same issue that, you know, what you're proposing does as well. It can't explain. And maybe I never discussed this with Howard at all. I did have some interaction with him, and when I was a young upstart and he was an older senior guy, it does not provide the accounting, the explanation for the thing that we're looking to explain. ACLMAP does. So with that, thanks for all the good thoughts, and please check through those references, because you may find that actually, you know, we coincide. I think what you're saying fits well within what ACLMAP tells us, but ACLMAP provides the reasons for it, if you will. Okay, thanks.
Any other comments or for the other speakers as well?
What I was going to say is that the pessimism, Victor's pessimism, actually, it's enough to start with the second law. The second law talks about maximization of entropy. We don't need the fourth one. But then it also gives us a little bit of room there. If we do work, then we can mitigate entropy. So entropy in some ways is laziness. If you just keep things going, they will go wherever they want to go. Then to keep them tidy, you have to put some work in.
Well, I was going to offer that in the thermodynamic neural network model that I presented yesterday, I struggled with this maximum entropy production idea. I didn't go with it. What I went with instead was, constrained equilibration is what I would call it locally in an interacting system. And what I found was that it evolved spontaneously to do something that looked something like what Rod was talking about over time. So.
Yeah, I would like to respond to Charlie's whole comment. Yes, so I think what he was saying that what we should strive for is an optimal entropy production, not maximal. There's no need for that. Obviously, absolutely, we don't need to produce that much entropy. We don't need to burn that much fuel. For example, right now we're not flying, right, on the airplanes. We're doing fine. Okay, so we don't really need that flying. However, as soon as flying on the airplanes will be permitted, okay, very likely people will start flying. Maybe not us, maybe not personally me. I personally don't plan to fly, but somebody will fly, and will burn that fuel because they can.
Victor, yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. Bill, go
ahead, William.
William, I think you have, did you want to say something, William? William Lawless?
Yes. Give me just a second here. Let me cut up the volume. Yeah, I had a couple of problems with the last two speakers. One of the problems with rational approaches to social systems is that there's no
Sorry about that.
There's no accounting for the loss of degrees of freedom. Let's take the issue of maximum entropy production. There's no consideration for the structures that might produce maximum entropy production. So there's no place to apply choice. There can be a vast difference in the way that two teams work. That's why you have competition between teams to see which one's the better team, which one can apply maximum entropy production better. And it has to do, in my opinion, with the structure, which is something that Prigogine, I think, was trying to get to. So that the better my structure, the least entropy I lose in my structure, the better I'm able to focus maximum entropy production.
So let's take these, to me, fairly enigmatic criticisms one at a time. First, that there's no accounting for the loss of degrees of freedom. Secondly, there's no consideration for the structure in this that might produce entropy. And finally, that there's no place to apply choice. So first, ACLMAP is all about the understanding of selection of macro from micro, the reduction, read loss if you prefer, of accessible microstates, that is degrees of freedom, from a much larger set, the disordered state that occurs during spontaneous ordering or autocatakinesis. Autocatakinetics shows how it happens, and LMEP, the fourth law, shows why. It is a physical selection principle, the physical selection principle that addresses this loss of freedom issue. Secondly, the criticism that there is no consideration for structure, the structure that might produce entropy. This is also upside down. The entire focus of ACLMAP is just such a consideration. It is all about the structures, autocatakinetic structures that populate the world around us. They are flow structures, of which us humans individually and our social systems collectively are kinds. And it provides a principal grounding for how those structures, ACK systems, arise and develop and or evolve in terms of entropy production. It is all about structuring. Finally, that there's no place to apply choice is also upside down. ACLMAP shows how life is itself an epistemic process. To touch base with Jay Dixon's opening remarks to this conference, and cognition arises coextensively with living systems and provides an understanding not only to the nomological basis for choices, which follows from invariant first law symmetry, but also shows the reasons why there should be epistemic systems to begin with. Finally, you should note that my final and concluding slide ends the talk on not just the issue of progressive loss of degrees of freedom. That happens in an ACK system, ACK structuring, of which human social systems are a kind over time.
Simo, I saw you raised your hand for a while, and I'll give you this mic to speak up, please. Simo Basara.
Muted.
I didn't understand you, Ram. You were kind of garbled there. Does somebody else have a comment? Carrie, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
No, actually, I saw Simo Burson raising his hand, and I was just updating to you, Todd.
Oh, I see. Okay, let me,
We just can't hear Simo.
Yes, and on our side, he's not muted. He's unmuted. I don't know if you're muted on your device, your computer.
I'll make a comment while he tries to configure his thing.
Okay.
One, to Victor's, I don't see it as renewable energy trying to compete, I'll do my air quotes, with fossil energy, the maximum power or maximum entropy principle, not the same, but I'm curious as to where people think we could actually run an experiment to define them differently or see if they don't always go together. But we could view the economy as essentially using renewable energy and fossil fuels together to maximize power flow or maximize entropy. So that seems to be what we're doing. And we could also look at the structures of economies. Most seem to be going towards something like capitalism or markets rather than away from it, and whether that is an inherent set of choices to maximize power flow, because they're short-term serving and maybe looking to maximize at short time frames.
In ecology, we have some global theories which look at the Earth as a living system, which means the Earth could eventually be made to dissipate entropy to the universe, but itself increase free energy and diminish entropy. There are some evidences that this can work, at least there are parts of ecosystems which are self-sustained in that direction. So I don't feel that negative. There is a future for the planet. It's just a question of how we have to build it. Nobody's going to give it to us.
Can I make a comment?
Just a question of whether humans will be in it.
Charles, we need to give somebody else a chance here. So who was trying to jump in?
Terry Bristol.
Terry, you're breaking up for some reason.
I will. I'll do my best here. Let me get the better connection real quick.
Can I ask a quick question about structure? I mean, I understand that there are optimal structures for reaching maximum entropy, but the structure itself needs to have been formed, and this requires the expenditure of energy and also through that the dissipation that creates additional entropy in other places. So how is it that we can reflex to the idea of structure as being what dictates or directs things without accounting for the energetics associated with the creation of the structure to do that?
The origin of structures, such structures, is just what LMAP explains. So from the moment of the origin of such systems, from the selection of macro, the new structure from micro, it occurs as a consequence of path selection for rate. That is the fourth law. So right from the time of the origins, it provides a new and more efficient sink for dissipating potential, a faster rate, actually by orders of magnitude, than its disordered or previously less ordered components.
Yes. Well, let me give you the best answer I can. We know that with humans that there are good teams and bad teams. Good teams tend to generate very little information. And I take that as a signature of a collapse of degrees of freedom. Poor teams, like say a couple who's getting divorced, they generate extraordinary amounts, copious amounts of information. So that their structure is very poor, and they're not able to focus the income and energy that they've got coming into them, into their team, to be able to solve the problems that life poses for them. They're too busy tearing apart their structure.
Okay, now I understand what I didn't see before as to why I'm hearing some things that seem so confusing. We need to underscore here, I think, and I think it would be a good idea if you did this actually in this context, to note that what you are talking about here is not physical or thermodynamic entropy, but some version of unbound, in the end untethered or subjective Shannon entropy. Clearly, this is not equivalent to thermodynamic entropy, which is what we are using when we're using the term or talking about LMAP or minimizing gradients or energetics or the like. And it's not necessarily even related. So in a discussion, I think it's important that we don't move seamlessly between the two. The words are the same. If we don't, and this clearly it can sponsor a lot of confusion. The term information, as you use it here, also seems to be an idiosyncratic use of Shannon information. And in my view, it should be labeled as such too.
Can I make a comment now, or do I get the audio?
The audio is still bad, Terry. I'm not sure what it is.
Can't understand it at all.
Comment now?
Yes, let's let Simal jump in. Terry, I don't know, maybe you've got a different microphone you can use.
Okay.
Can you hear me now, Todd?
I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. So what I want to say is he showed a picture to disprove the Boltzmann's equation. Well, first of all, if he goes through Boltzmann's mathematical derivation, that picture proves his mathematical derivation. It doesn't disprove it, because you cannot think of Boltzmann's derivation in his original paper without the first law, So essentially, energy operates on a terrain, and it just goes from one minimum to another minimum point. It is like a ball. You have a terrain. You kick it from one point, it will just find another equilibrium point. It will go to that point. So order, disorder are just relative terms. It's with respect to a previous location. It doesn't mean disorder, chaos. Initial can be chaos, next can be order. So the system will always go to the next equilibrium minimum energy point, but it will follow Boltzmann's derivation. So therefore, actually, the picture he shows, it doesn't disprove Boltzmann mathematical derivation, it proves it. So that is what I wanted to say.
Well, of course, this is not true. I think what you're doing here is engaging in the modeler's fallacy. And this is a big problem in the physical and tech sciences with algorithmic theory and so on. But the main point here is that if your interpretation of Boltzmann's theory were true, the entire history of science in the last 100 years would be different, because the second law would not have been viewed as a law of disorder. Life and the rise of human social systems, in general, the entire visible world around us, including us, and its evolution would not have been seen as going from more to less probable states or against the laws of physics. And in that case, we wouldn't need the fourth law. But clearly, this is not the case. I think what you're doing here actually is picking an argument with Boltzmann himself, whose writings, and if you haven't read them, or if others haven't read Boltzmann, you should. Very important read, a great read to do, and you can see the conundrum he was aware he himself was caught in, but he was crystal clear regarding the improbability of order, which he defined quite clearly. And this is where the notion that the second law is a law of disorder, or was a law of disorder, comes from. Our experiment that we showed clearly falsifies this claim. And the world is not reducible to a stochastic collision function of an ideal gas modeled as billiard balls in a box. But finally, just I might add that I don't think anybody is trying to minimize the importance of statistical mechanics. That's not the point here. The point is that the Boltzmann reduction of the second law fails. And the fourth law provides the answer that the second law doesn't. But we should, by the way, be cautious of statistical mechanics, which in many cases today are being misused or misapplied, something that we should be very careful about. Okay, thank you.
I had a question for Wasim, which is, since you're a real engineer and build real stuff, how does the engineering world respond when you start talking about thermodynamics in the way that you do?
Actually, they're quite receptive to it, because they see the effect in terms of stabilization, especially when these systems are very large systems and you can't get very accurate models for these systems. But if you actually perform a thermodynamic stabilization, you really don't need to know the model exactly, because what happens with the second law is that if you basically take the principle that more energetic subsystems are going to dump the energy to the less energetic subsystems and eventually reach an equipartition state, then you get inherent stabilization without actually having an accurate model. So I've worked with GE and a few other places where they've implemented these controllers very successfully and showed significant performance over other architectures.
I actually have a question to Wasim as well, if I may. Quick comment. I mean, I was really impressed by that your presentation. How if you put these discrete controllers to basically introduce dissipation and bring stabilize basically the system. Yes. And I connected this with the first talk of this morning by Steve Keen. So Steve Keen, I know if you heard his talk this morning, the very first one, 8:30. He had some system of differential equations, some kind of dynamical system, and it produces some sort of instability called Minsky moment, in the economy, money, debt, and all that. Mm-hmm. And it's nonlinear equations, which look roughly similar to your kind of engineering equations. Yeah. And he runs his equation. They produce economic and financial instability. And I wonder if your kind of engineering controls are added to his economical dynamical system equations, maybe that will be able to suppress this economic instabilities. In other words, we need to control economic system appropriately, very in a smart way, like engineers do, in order to suppress those instability. That may be like policies of central bank, there may be some discrete intervention. I would really love you guys, you two guys, you and Steve King get together and apply your control system methods to his economic equations and to see what kind of financial monetary policies are actually needed from a engineering point of view.
Yes, actually, that would be something very interesting. A problem that I didn't talk about is also optimality, because you can also embed optimality into the architecture of the controller. I didn't want to touch that problem because I just wanted to keep it on the physics base, but you can actually affect these hybrid architectures that are also optimal with respect to a particular metric. Of course, when you talk about optimality, you need to quantify what it is that you're optimal with respect to. Is it RMS, root mean square error? Is it what kind of norm that you capture, or a distance that you might capture between some point and some other point? So optimality will also play a role and give you better performance ultimately.
I think some of the advantage of people who apply control theory to economic, whatever, control or policies in the past, but perhaps some of the control theory ideas that can be added is if the economists are trying to, one, control the wrong system because they have the wrong model, two, control the economy into a way that's not possible or into an unobserved,
So that's an interesting.
We're trying to grow it generally, not stabilize it, right?
Yes. So you could drive it to a particular trajectory or a particular manifold if you're trying to grow it. You don't have to stabilize it. Engineers think of stabilization because they don't want things to break apart. But you can also look at it from another perspective. You could drive it to a particular set point that's not necessarily decrease the oscillations, but rather perhaps drive it to a particular manifold. But yes.
So I think we're going to have to wrap up here in basically a minute. So I think because the next session begins in 5 minutes, I think that that session T11, can correct me if I'm wrong, Christine, T11 is on this particular Zoom meeting room and T10 is on the other one. Is that correct?
No. Actually, it's opposite.
Opposite. Okay, good thing I asked. I'm getting everything wrong. Okay, so T10 is on this one. If you're going to T10, stay here. T11 is on the other one.
Yes.
That's great, Tom.
And
okay.
I put the link in the group chat.
Okay, links in the group chat. Okay, good thing I asked somebody who actually knows.
Okay.
So let's do maybe we got I don't know, another quick question or so, and we'll probably have to give up. There were several in the chat. Does somebody want to bring those up?
Can I try again, or am I still terrible?
No, you sound good now.
Can I make my question then, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so it seems to me that this has to do with models. How, a lot of the thermodynamic models people are looking at now have, one system acting on another and so forth. But if you go to, the ecology stuff, think of Gaia theory, and as I pointed out, Vernadsky was one of the early ones that pointed out that the waste of one thermodynamic agent, so to speak, is the resources for another. And this is developed as a really good development of this is in Felkowski's book called Life's Engines. And they're talking about life at the deep sea vents, and what formed there is you get two groups of bacteria. One, for instance, is using sulfur at, say, valence -5 and exports it at +3. The other group loves it at +3 and exports it at -5. Now, I mean, it sort of gets to Terry Deacon stuff, what he was looking at, but the idea that the whole system is going to max entropy is kind of crazy. Also, the idea of the Earth is the Earth is in thermodynamic equilibrium in the sense that the oxygen producers and the CO2 producers are going back and forth on are feeding each other, but it's also in thermodynamic disequilibrium. The system has been in thermodynamic disequilibrium for like at least 3 billion years. So it's got these two components. It got the equilibrium component, which is sort of like a homeostasis, and it's got the disequilibrium component. The question is, how do you put those two together? But
Thank you.
Can I comment on Terry's work in this context?
Please.
Yeah, you brought up Terry, so Deacon. What's interesting in sort of the pessimism that that you guys were referring to earlier, Terry has some interesting points about self-organizing systems being regularizing, that they will in fact shorten the pathway and maximize entropy, but in doing so they tend to pull out the rug from under themselves, by dissipating their own available gradient. But then he tries to go a step further, and this may go sort of the last point, to talk about regularization, that looking at our society today is not a foregone conclusion with its obvious entropy maximization, but that a lack of regulation. And so Terry would talk about in his autogen, and I suggest you check that out if you're interested, but moving one step beyond regularization and logically moving to self-regulation, which is distinct from regularization, in its ability to imagine, for example, like as the Gibbs free energy is being consumed, that right before it goes to equilibrium, there's another process that sort of does a diving catch in order to preserve the potential to do the dynamic in some other environment. In that sense, that it's sort of counter to the maximum entropy story, because it's not maximizing entropy. It's actually right before it dissipates its entire gradient, there's another process, complementary process, that actually slows entropy in order to save a dynamic for a future time, future place.
And with that, Josh, thank you. I'm going to have to cut you off, but we're wrapping up so that we don't impinge on the next speakers. Thanks to all the speakers today. It was a very great session, great discussion too.
Thank you, Todd, for handling this session so great, and I learned a lot.